Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to our series here that was dreamed up by the really productive Tyler Gabriel and her lucky husband, Douglas. But so we're into this with our 12th episode of interviews with exorcists, the Gabriel Chronicle, and it's starting to getting into some real interesting territory because you could see that Douglas is starting to consolidate a worldview. He's consolidating his cosmology through the work of Rudolf Steiner, and there's plenty of resource there because it's 36 and a half feet of shelf space. So, daunting proposal at bare minimum. And so we're going to let him continue on in his adventures in trying to find the Philosopher's Stone. Douglas, how are you?
I'm doing great, John. Wonderful intro there. Yes, that's exactly what is happening. And Tyler always makes sure to say, now, are you making sure that you put in there the cosmology? People need to understand this. So it's not just a biography, but it's showing how one person can develop along this path. And because I happen to be born clairvoyant, clairaudient, clairsentient, I'm able to interact with some of these things and see if I can, within myself, within my own personal, quite awake knowing, see if some of the things that I had studied in college, of course, to get my PhDs in comparative religion, philosophy, and anthroposophy and history, and all these different degrees. When I was in Europe, I was trying to figure out if it was true, and I didn't really know. I'd been studying from books. What did I know? I was a hillbilly from the Ozarks and really hadn't been too many places except to nature. I was totally into nature. So for me, my recourse was always to go out to the Sequoia Forest or to spectacularly beautiful places in America. But when I got to Europe, oh, that was completely different. I had never come up on buildings that were hundreds of years old, let alone thousands of years old. So if I touched them, in some cases, especially if I put myself into a sensitive, imaginal condition, uh, I could start to actually see things or hear things or know things about those places. So, of course, because one of my degrees was in comparative religion, and I had taken the path to show that the great goddess of birth, death, and rebirth is the primal religion, the ubiquitous religion everywhere, and that beyond 2000 BC, going back any further, you're going into what would not technically be called a matriarchal age, but an age that was more focused on the birthing woman and the mystery processes of procreation. And those then manifested in all of the great mythologies. So, as I'm going in this trip now that I'm going to take you on, I'm going to basically be showing you how I was following the path, the golden path of the Magna Mater. Here she is, right here, the Great Mother.
Yes, just to give some backstory out of the work of Rudolf Steiner. If you go to it's published in English as Atlantis and Lemuria, and in there he explains how the birth of language was a sacred event that was came into being through the singing of women, and that's very much a key to what you're addressing here.
Absolutely. And I don't know, did I talk about Lourdes last time?
I know we didn't get that far into.
Well, here's a perfect example for you. I'm traveling around looking at all the Gothic cathedrals in Europe, and particularly the ones that make up the 22 stars in the constellation of Virgo, which many people say that if you project that onto the Western Europe, you'll actually find all of the Gothic cathedrals that were Celtic in origin, that were centered around wells. And these wells always were associated either with fairies, like in Borciolanda. There was Vivian and the whole Arthurian legend. When you finally had surrendered to Arthur, you had to take your sword and go wash it in the spring in Brociolanda, which basically was extremely dangerous to do. So it was a path of initiation. So I'm trying to figure this out because I'd studied Maria Gimbutas and used her in my PhD on comparative religions to say that it was ubiquitous throughout the Neolithic Western Europe. So after I realized that I wasn't going to find a place in America to study anthroposophy, I went to England first, and Wales and Ireland, Scotland, so on. And then I went to the continent and went to Dornach, which I've described, and Stuttgart, and all these places. And I couldn't find any place in anthroposophy. So I basically said that. And then I told the story of I went to St. Peter's at the time of the when he was being turned into a saint, when he was being canonized. It just happened on to the very moment when the Pope Paul came out and basically was addressing the crowd, got into the secret places of the Vatican because they had them open for this gigantic festival. And then after that, I went to Lourdes. I just happened there. I think I told this story with you. A couple of these stories I'm going to repeat that we talked about in previous talks on your.
We did it on my channel.
Exactly, on your YouTube. So I'm going to repeat these in a shorter form. So I go to Lourdes, and I happen in, again, like happened so many times, when there's a giant festival happening and there's so many people there, it is mind-boggling. There's no way I will get a room, and certainly not in a youth hostel. And so basically I stumble into this thing in the daytime, and I go down to Lourdes, go to the grotto, drink the water, get the water, put it in my canteen, blah, 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 sneak around, get in the water. And I'm like, it's gone. Whatever magic was here is gone. But, and this is the key factor, because I'm an American. So when I went to Europe, everything is like levity. It's like floating up. It's so easy to see. It's ridiculous. In American, no, you have an extra double, Steiner calls it. You have an electromagnetic extra double on you that kind of limits you unless you're in the Ozarks, which are the oldest mountains in America, and run east-west instead of north-south. North-south mountains create this electromagnetic field around Americans. So I get to Europe and boom, that's gone. It's like I'm a child in a candy shop. Now, mind you, when I say that I'm clairvoyant, clairaudient, clairsentient, clairsentient means like telekinetic. You can touch things and get more than an impression. If it comes through that, it's usually an intuition, and it's so powerful that sometimes you'll get a whole visual and an auditory thing at the same time, and you're seeing multiple time streams and blah, 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 blah. But what you get at the end is whatever question you had when you touched the thing. Well, I didn't know that until I got to Europe. So now here I am, and I'm going to Stonehenge, and I'm going, well, I wonder what Stonehenge is about. And you touch it and go, whoa, okay, that's what that's about. And then you go to the next place and you're going, I'm going to every place. I'm going to every ancient place I can. And what am I looking for? The great goddess, the triple goddess. I'm looking for the historical archaeological verification of that, as well as, we pointed out, the Grail. And so what happens when you study the Grail in Europe? You're going to come to springs. Like I mentioned before, White Spring and Chalice Well at Glastonbury. And what is that? In the old days, they had these springs everywhere, and these beautiful maidens tended them, and she had a golden goblet that she'd give you water from, right? But they also were called fairy women, who might enchant you. And like Vivian in Brosiolanda would give you the water that would heal, even heal the broken sword, in that tradition, Arthurian tradition. Or you would offer your sword in allegiance to who? The fairy queens of the wells, of the springs. So I mentioned last time that I went to a number of these immediately, Aachen and what other one did I mention? Anyway, I went to like over 20, 30 of these things. And what I was trying to get at was I wanted to be in the temple, I'd call it a church, by myself with no one there. Then I'd put my head up against the stone that had been there for hundreds and hundreds of centuries, and in some cases, millennia. And then I would go into a condition to try to see if I could ferret out if it was true that every one of these was built on a Celtic site with a well in the basement, and that in most cases there was a Black Madonna there. Now, I'm not going to get into what the Black Madonna is. Let's just say it's all those traditions I'm talking about rolled into one, including Mary and the wondrous child and Sarah and blah, 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 blah. You roll it all together, Isis and Horus and Osiris, the whole thing. That's what you get there. But I wanted to find out, basically, because remember, these churches are graveyards. They have the most important, significant individuals of their time buried there, and I could witness them if there was any of them as ghosts. But these places are so filled with the elemental presence of people's worship that there was different things there. There was the past it was built upon. There was the amazing structure, which is frozen music. It's really the music of the spheres, or the Dionysian artificers. It's the great builders of the East, of Greece, and all this merged into the next stage of evolution, the Gothic cathedral. So if you just stand there and you touch the stone, I could feel the people who built it. I could feel all kinds of mysteries that were built into it, that they were using it as what would you call it, an external hymnal. Many of them on the outside have all the saints. And in the old days, you didn't even get to go into the service until you had memorized the saints, what they had done, because those were the characterological, holy, virtuous aspects of a human being. And once you had understood the lives of the saints and you understood the mystery of the Trinity, which is all in the outside of these structures in many cases, then you would come to the portico, you'd come to the entrance, and there is the great mystery. So you might stand on that portico for a long time as a believer before they'd even let you in. You had to know the doctrine so that when you went inside, you could realize that these were architectural hymns. They were architectural praise, psalms to God, and all you had to do was stand there. And this is exactly what I was going there for. So as I told you, I went to Aachen, sat on the throne that all the German kings and Frankish kings were. So I would get into these places, and almost usually, because this was back in the early 70s or mid 70s, it was always open. They weren't locked. You could stay there as long as you want. And when people in the tours were gone, well, you were there alone. Nobody was living in these. So you got to be in these tombs of celestial majesty, with the most perfect alignment you could imagine with the heavens. Well, later I found out that's what all the temples are, but I didn't know that at first. And I didn't know I went to a bunch of them before I realized, oh, all I have to do is ask a question before I go into a sensitive state of perception, just using super sensible organs, that I could get the answers. For instance, in some of these places, they'd have relics that had crazy stories. And I wanted to find out if they were true. Well, you don't just get to walk up to the altar in the daytime. But after everybody leaves, I went right up to the altar, put my hand right on the relic, because there has to be a relic where they do the transubstantiation. And I'd feel this, or I'd feel the sacred cask that had the head of St. Steve, or the arrows that post, or the blood of Christ that becomes liquid on a certain. So you can get close to these things. They got smart, though. In some of them, they put the reliquary, they put it on chains and raise it way up, way high so nobody could touch it. But imagine, I was also going to all the great museums. And if they didn't have glass around it, well, then I'd touch it. And if I touched it and I stood there for just a little while, it would speak. It would tell its story. So I realized after a while, okay, I can't find a place to be an anthroposophist and live in Europe, but I can do further studies now on the ground, boots on the ground, going from place to place to find out if the true nature of the triple goddess and the way it came into the Catholic, the Catholic Church at first, but into Christianity. And so when I went to Lourdes, I'm looking at this incredible church that they built. And I went down to the grotto, nothing's going on. So I asked people who work there, how often do people get healed? Oh, very seldom, very seldom. Oh, really? Well, when was the last time someone saw the Mother Mary, they would say. They built a huge church tour saying it was Mother Mary. And they'd say, oh, well, that hasn't happened since, the visionaries, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I was very disappointed, but there's all these people. So I'm going up and I'm looking for a place to go up in the woods to sleep. Because as I told you before, I could sleep anywhere. And I didn't need a sleeping bag or anything. I just lie on the ground, sleep anywhere. So I'm looking up to the side of the church, and I can see there's a spring up there. So I go around, I go up to the spring, and here's the spring. And by golly, guess who's there? The lady that they would say was the Lady of Lourdes. Oh, she's still there, but she's in the spring above because they put the water through pipes and cement and gross human blood. No wonder she doesn't go down to the grotto anymore. And those people are just, they're materialists trying to disprove it more than to prove it. So here I am looking at a Nixie at the spring coming out of the mountain with a rock kind of grotto, not very big. But had you taken the wrong step, you would have slid down the mountain and crashed into the road. And would have been, that's, I'm sure they even had signs, don't go up there, right? So I went up there, there's the spring. Now there's what I'm talking about. The natural elemental beings, the natural beings are one thing. The elementals are another thing. The worship, the elementals created by ritual worship there at Lourdes or at Fatima, where I went, or in Medjugorje or in Portugal, any of these places you go, there's all kinds of holiness created by people's worship. That's a different type of elemental. That is not an independent being. But what I was after was the beings themselves.
Yes, which is really, that's a deeply esoteric point you're making, but if somebody doesn't have more pieces to the puzzle, it's not as easy to put together. But if you go to the lecture cycle, Universe, Earth, and Man, you see that Rudolf Steiner there addresses the idea, and he's talking in reference to the astral world and the relationship between the astral world and the etheric. And he says that when people hold an idea, that idea has a relationship to an actual being. See, so the concept behind these relics, you have to keep in mind, it doesn't even matter if it's a real relic or not, but everybody's focusing their intention and their ideas and their feelings toward that idea of that being a relic, an actual relic. And if it is, hey, great, but it's that focus that brings it together. And so what Douglas is, in my mind, is relating to is when you enter into that idea, you join that company of being. See, and so you're not alone. And that's like when I wrote my first book, I felt like it was a phone book,
That's so true, John. So true. And thanks for that clarification, because sometimes the things I'm saying are just so natural to me because I've been doing this since I was born up until the time I was 54. In case anyone's interested, I don't do that anymore. Sometimes I get impressions, but not like this in the old days. And then I learned by going to the most ancient places that you could ask questions and get answers. And that was the amazing thing. And these answers, either you'd get something or you wouldn't. And so, of course, I went to all the places that were supposedly noted for King Arthur and Guinevere, and any place I could that supposedly had magical energy that I'd read about, and I'd read quite a bit. So when I went to the mainland, to the continent, as they call it, to Western Europe, I went to all these different places trying to find out, especially things like Saint-Michel in Normandy, and went out. And then I'd say, why did they name it St. Michael? Then I would study while I was there. And if travel is the greatest form of education there is, period. You find things that are there that you won't find anything else, places, certainly not in books. So I found out at all the different places, whether it was in England, in St. Michael Church, which is offshore, and the water rises and you can't get to it, and it goes down and there's a road. Same thing with Saint-Michel in Normandy, and St. Michael in Gorgano and all these places. So I'd go there. Or even in the Vatican, I had already heard about the spear of Longinus. And as I mentioned before, I went to Austria to figure out if that was real. In my opinion, it's a copy. And of course, it is not the spear that stabbed the side of Christ. And the chalices that they say are the Holy Grails, well, there's many, many of them. And there's supposedly many pieces of the cross. I would check these things out. And if it was real, John can attest, like the story I told, when I came upon in going to look at the St. Fernarius icon, It wasn't that had the energy. It was a reliquary next to it that had one thing was real for sure, and it was a piece of the cloth of Mary. And as you heard in the story, blue lightning bolt came out of my hand over there and led us over there instead of looking at what people thought was healing them, the St. Fernarius icon. Well, that's what I was doing, and I shouldn't have been doing it. And as I said before, Steiner says, don't go back and try to re-unsheath yourself from a previous incarnation. You're just probably going to get your astral body, which will just lead you down the exact wrong trail. You might replicate what you did in your last life that you resolved. Oh, but now you're going to do it again. You're going to waste an entire incarnation trying to be like you were before. That's complete nonsense. That's not quite what I was after, even though, yes, I must admit in the back of my mind, I wanted to know if someplace was going to say, this is who you were in a previous incarnation. But I got indications. And later, what I told you about with eating the cell off of one of my cells from a previous incarnation, which lit me up like like you can't even believe. I still didn't figure out who I was then. It took like 16, 20 years later because of some research John did and some people I met that I finally figured out who that was.
Yes, well, it gets into some pretty deep waters because you're talking, like, for example, you made reference to Chartres Cathedral, and there's that whole series of Notre Dame cathedrals in France that are laid out. If you could see, were you way up in the air, you could envision that it was a map of the constellation of Virgo, whereas the Benedictines, there was a constellation of the Great Bear. But that these cathedrals were built on old mystery sites, where the old Celtic culture before that, there always would be a well. And you get into that idea. There were statues of Isis at some of these places before the church ever was installed there. So that there was this spreading of this very, very ancient stream of mystery wisdom. And Rudolf Steiner does talk about how when Moses left Egypt, Moses was a high priest of the city of On, which is the city of Heliopolis in the Delta. It's the city of the sun. And that when he left with Jehovah Elohim, with Christ working through Jehovah Elohim, guiding him out, that he took the mysteries of Osiris with him. And so his spouse Isis became the widow. And you have this whole tradition of the widow that's very, very significant within the Manichaean and tied into certain streams relative to the troubadours. And it really gets into a significant level of culture that has only really been seriously addressed in the last 100 years of any depth, other than obscure works that an ordinary person wouldn't run across. So it's in this newer cycle that we're in that there's starting to come more relevant data to understand the mystery of Sophia and the mystery of that wisdom. You know, you have the first, second, and third logos, and Christ is the second logos, the Father's the first, and then the Holy Spirit. That is the third logos, and that is the tongues of flame that appeared over the apostles. And so you have that wisdom stream. And Rudolf Steiner had said, it's not Christ we lack, it's the Sophia of Christ, the wisdom aspect, so that you have that, because wisdom without love can be ruthless, and love without wisdom can be reckless. So that you have to bring the wisdom and the love together. And that has to do with it, very much tying the brow chakra to the throat chakra in preparation for the heart chakra of 12 petals.
Well said, well said. And so that's why they think that the Grail is in Chalice Well. Okay, you think, well, that's stupid. Why would they take the Holy Grail and stick it into a well that nobody can get it? That doesn't make any sense. No, it's because it's showing you that that is where there's a doorway to the elemental kingdom. And so the wisdom that would be found in the well is really your heart. The chalice is your heart. And who is the being that leads you into the elemental or the fairy kingdom? That would be your etheric body. So when you're looking at these things, you're looking at yourself. And if you haven't developed yourself, that's not going to mean anything to you. So other people um, might go to these places and find nothing going on there. But someone like myself goes there and they can start to see, like a mirror, the ability to remove the concepts that stop you from actually perceiving what's there. Anyone, if I was standing there with somebody, I could help them see the Nixie, but that's not Mother Mary. The Nixie's always been there. The Nixie was always there at all springs that are fresh and pure and clean that are open to air. That's what happens. The sylphs and the undines mix together and they create a Nixie. Hello, it's just a simple alchemical process of nature. But what we have as belief, oh, that's a completely different thing, as John has explained. So here I am in Italy, and I'm getting closer to places that I have had insinuations that I had previously incarnated, and I'm checking this out and checking that out and going, okay, well, I think I should go to Greece because my assumed father, John Gabriel's dad, came from Greece when he was 12 years old. He stowed away in a ship and came to America and became a millionaire. And he never spoke English again the second he hit the shores, and he was a true American. But later I found out that's not really my dad, so that's not really my granddad. But I go to Greece to go back to the very place that he was raised, which my aunt had shown me pictures of, that she had been there not too long before. And nothing had changed in all those years by the time I got there, and I was checking this out. But what I did find was that my interest in the great goddess exploded when I went to Mycenae and I went to Sparta and heard about of course, Theseus in Athens, but also Theseus and his island. What was it called? Skyros. And then knowing the stories of Troy. So here I am in Greece, kind of trying to ferret out my own bloodline, realizing I don't relate. I don't relate. This isn't me. That's not my granddad and my grandfather. It's not him. But I come upon Mycenae, go into the fortress there, go into the city there, which was, of course, one time ruled the Mediterranean. And it was the home of Agamemnon, who'd married the sister of Helen of Troy, who was actually Helen of Sparta, who had married Menelaus, who previously, once I started looking into this, it finally dawned on me, also had married Theseus. And then married Paris of Troy, which then makes her 900 years old. So when she's with Paris, so I don't know, maybe she had some good beauty secrets, but it's kind of really strange that this being, Helen, as I start to look, history that is in the books starts to fade away. So here I am on the Acropolis, and right there, the Trinity of the goddess couldn't be more explicit. There's three temples. The large temple everybody knows of is to Athena, and she's all in armor, and she has an owl that knows everything sitting on her shoulder. And she, of course, was born out of the head of Zeus, as it were. And then on one side, there's another temple, and that's Athena as basically Demeter. It's called the Erection. That's where they brought all of their grain and stored it, and they had festivals for the harvest. Well, that became where coins were then made to represent the grain. So that's a bank. So you have the Athena in the Acropolis. Uh, I mean, Athena in the central temple, Nike in the other temple, and she's of course the goddess of victory. So you have three aspects of Athena: the goddess of harvest, the goddess of war, and the goddess of victory. And then I found out the funny thing: coins started there with the grains that were stored in the temple, and in the temple of Nike was held the meteorites, because most Greek temples have a secret chamber where they hold two things: meteorites, well, actually three, coins, it's like a bank, and meteorites, and large bones, which they say are the bones of the Titans. So they literally say, here's the bones of Athena that show that she's 20. That's the reason they built the statue so tall. That's how they knew how big to make the building, the temple for her, uh, which made her 27 feet tall. Those were bones of dinosaurs that they excavated when they were building the temple. And then I go around, no one tells you this. You're not going to find this. And John will find it in a book, but I hadn't found it in any books that they actually were. And then outside of every temple is the omphalos. No one will tell you that. You look it up and they'll tell you now on Wikipedia. But basically, to find a book that tells you what an omphalos is, good luck. The omphalos looks like a beehive with actually the patterns that we'd call the ecliptic and the north and moon node right on it. So basically, it's a cosmological link. They called it the navel, but it looked like a beehive with a hole in the top, or they would just stylize it as a pine cone. And some will say, well, that represents the pineal gland. Well, no, it represents the navel, that they're saying this is sacred ground. So no matter where you go, if you go to Olympus, you'll find, especially the male temples, the omphalos very prominently displayed, a copy of it there. If you go to Delos, you'll find it there, Delphi. If you go to any of the temples, the big temples, if you go to Ephesus, you won't find it there because they destroyed that one quite thoroughly. But at many of these beautiful Greek temples, you find the threefold goddess represented more clearly than anyone. At Ephesus, it was supposedly a temple to Artemis, but look closely, it was a temple to Cybele, and it was a temple to Hecate. It's always threefold with the goddess. So here I am in Greece trying to figure out my bloodline, and I start to stumble on the fact that all I have to do is go into the museum. Now that I know what I'm looking for, make sure nobody's looking around, touch the thing that I want to talk to me, and it tells me, especially it'll tell you, like Socrates' daemon, the conscience, will tell you if you're wrong, right? If you're wrong, it'll go, oh, you're stupid. It'll tell you, no, you have no clue no, that's not what I am. But if you touch it and it happens to be correct, it all starts to click, and the beings behind these things, not the elemental force of worship, but the beings start to talk. And that then led me, because on the boat coming over to Greece, I met a guy named George. He's Greek, spoke Greek. He's from Australia, but he's coming to Greece for a visit of his family. And so I started hanging out with this guy, and he introduces me to somebody because I just couldn't keep my mouth shut. I would say things and indicate that, I could give someone a reading, as I'd call it. Oh, would you like for me to give you a reading of what I think about that? And they go, well, yeah, well, sure, whatever. So he introduces me to this person, and he's laughing because he's seen me do this a bunch of times with people. And, he just can't believe that I can be so correct about it. So we sit down with this guy, just looks like a nice Greek dude, and we're at a bar or something, and he says, give this guy a reading. And I'm going, okay. And I go, oh, whoa, dude, look, I can't give you a reading. I have to warn you. What, are you a captain of a ship or something? And you have a dishonest pilot or a co-pilot? Or you have to be very careful. In the next few weeks, you're going to have a disaster. Matter of fact, it's going to be horrible. And he's going to steal everything in the safe. I didn't know there were safes on later. I find out he's a cruise ship captain, right? And he goes from one cruise ship to the next because he knows the Mediterranean, like a pilot. So I warned him of this and say, the ship's going to go down. And I'm like yelling this at him, right? And so he didn't think much of what I said because I stayed mostly on that. And I told him what his job was and what he did. And he thought it was a setup or something. So a few weeks later, George and I are there and we're seeing the TV, and here's his uncle. This was his uncle. And the ship's going down, and exactly what I predicted was true. The co-pilot stole the contents of the safe, had a helicopter pick him up only, and everyone else was going down with the ship and had to be saved by boats, exactly as I described. So this guy then calls up George and says, George, you tell your friend he has a free trip on any boat that I am captain and piloting in the Mediterranean, any tour he wants. So I got free tours for, I don't know, a couple months. And all I had to do was either sit at the captain's table or sit at the table next to the captain's table and give 3 readings a day to whomever he told me to give the readings to. And then I got the full ticket. Every time we went on, they stop, they stop in ports and you go on tours. Went on every tour, and it was fed like a king. All I had to do was buy a suit so that I would fit in, because you have to be fancy on these cruise ships. So here I am on some of the biggest cruise ships in the Mediterranean, going to all these amazing places that I had dreamt about, really, but never ever could have imagined. Plus, that cruise, I couldn't have afforded that. So the first place we go is to Crete, and boom, the triple goddess is so clear there. It's unbelievable, and that's where the labyrinth is, and that's why all the Gothic cathedrals in the early days had labyrinths on them, because it was the labyrinth of Knossos, which of course Theseus came to bring back, to Greece. That was the patriarchal Theseus takeover of the matriarchal Minoan culture, and also the Mycenaean culture was a patriarchal culture taking over the Minoan culture. And so I'm going, oh, Helen is not a person. She's the matriarchy. She's the beauty of the great goddess, the triple goddess. And then from that point on, oh, everything became so clear. Every time I'd go someplace, I'd say, oh, now I get it. Just look behind the scenes. Don't believe a word they say. Go to the museum and touch the objects. Or Knossos is restored, but some of the kivas outside of it, that's what the Omphalos is. It's the birthing kiva of the matriarchal culture. It's the navel. They climb in through the hole in the top. That's exactly what all Omphalosis have. So it all started to just become clearer. And after that, every place that I went was just like, I couldn't even, I was overwhelmed. I didn't hardly even, I slowed down a lot, because I saw that it was almost overwhelming to have almost all the history I was ever taught, and I really focused on history and philosophy and religions and mythology. Most of it was nonsense.
Yeah, Rudolf Steiner makes some interesting comments regarding the labyrinth. And he says that it's an image of the convolutions of the brain. And so, well, where are you going to go with that? Well, if you get into the sacrament of the Eucharist, the Last Supper with Christ, it's the bread and the wine. And the bread is that macrocosmic, cosmic mystery. And the wine is the microcosm. And so the Grail holds the wine, which is the blood. And so that's that heart mystery. And so you have this cosmic realm, the 12-fold aspect that's reflected in the 24 pairs of cranial nerves. So that's 12 and 12 is 24. So you have that image of that star wisdom coming at you as cosmic light and wisdom. Because Steiner says that the astral is the stars. You see the stars, that's the astral. And the blueness of the sky is the etheric. And so it's because the astral is reflecting on the etheric, that's how you can actually be aware of all this stuff going on. Most people don't, I'm sure, know that. But when you go to sleep, your astral body and your ego go off in the realm of dream, and then your etheric body and your physical body are still laying on the bed. They're like living like a plant existence, deep, dreamless sleep state, so that they can heal all the agitations that result from the ego and the astral body through the course of the day, and you get tired. And so if you get into the Greek mythos with Rudolf Steiner's analysis, the best source I know of is the Wonders of the World lecture cycle that I frequently reference. It's available here on YouTube, and it's in the archive, and it's published as a book, and absolutely wonderful.
And if you don't read it in this life, John will bother you into your next life, telling you must read Wonders of the World, Revelations of the Soul. No, what is it? Tribulations of the Soul, Revelations of the Spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in there, they really tell you these things about the Greek myths that you go, what are you talking about? No history book ever says that. I could go into that, but it'll give me a little bit off track. So I'm on Knossos, and I realize all of a sudden they have no walls. I go through their museums, they have no weapons. And so the male patriarchal group came in and took over, and they tried to say that the wings of the queen of Knossos, there's three queens. One queen has the 12 heads, just as you pointed out, the 12 heads of the zodiac, and they're all animals. So the goddess has 12 different heads, they're all animals. But when you come down into the heart, she has wings, and they'll say it's an axe, a double-headed axe. There was no weapons in Minoan culture, there were no walls. And in the Mycenaean culture, both in Mycenae and in Spartan and in other places, they had no walls. Who started walls? Ilium, Troy. And what did they do? They were trying to protect Helen. And what was Helen? Helen had a magic stone that all of her pain and suffering would be absorbed by this stone that she wore. It absorbed her tears. And she also carried with her the palladium. Well, Athena had the palladium in her hand, in her right hand, and Nike was a symbol of that palladium. People say, some say that it was carved wooden ebony, black. I say no, it is absolutely a meteorite. I have meteorites who look like a winged goddess, and so I believe the palladium. And the myth was whoever owned the palladium controlled the world. They were the power that ruled the world, and that's one of the reasons some would say that the Greeks not only came to get Troy, came to get Helen, but they came to get the palladium. And as you know, Odysseus took, in one version, the Greek version, he took it. In another version, the Roman Aeneas took it and founded Rome with it. And then the palladium in history gets kind of lost and then found and lost and found. And last time that we know it was around, it was under a column in Constantinople, where Constantine had taken it and put a statue that was of a god with the crown of thorns, supposedly, and the nails of the cross, and underneath it, the palladium. So I'm looking for all indications of what does this mean? Are these things physical? Just like the spear of destiny. Is it physical? I want to know if it's physical. And if I get close enough to it, and if I can touch it, then maybe I can find out. So I'm in Knossos and I'm touching this and touching that. And I start to realize, oh no, here it is. It's the myth of Europa. A Phoenician princess is stolen by Zeus in the form of a white bull that comes across the Mediterranean and lands on Knossos. And that Zeus was born in a cave where these goddesses or these priestesses made a whole lot of noise so that Cronus wouldn't come down and eat his, what it was, his sixth or seventh child like he did the others as a stone. So they hid Zeus. But then Zeus goes over to Phoenicia in the form of a bull, grabs the girl, Europa, brings her to the island of Crete. What is that? That's the subsuming of the matriarchal culture, the female-based, the mother-based, the triple goddess culture. So everywhere I look, so that I look at the wings, the double-headed axe of the goddess of Knossos. And what do this historian say? Oh, that's really that's because they thought at some point they'll concede and say she thought she was a bee, and so those are her wings. Well, look at Cupid. What did they do to even Cupid, who was really Eros? They shrank him down, put diapers on him, and yet he was the one that the gods and men and heroes and titans were scared of because his bow could elicit love in the person that the arrow struck. So, and what was the myth of Ariadne and Theseus? The subsuming of the wisdom of basically what's called the bicameral mind, as John pointed out, is the convolutions of the brain. That's what the labyrinth is. It's a picture of the convolutions of the brain and basically saying we can go between left and right brain, and now is the age when we do. The matriarchal culture was more right-brained. The patriarchal culture more left-brained. And then they started developing war and weapons and building walls to protect things that were what? It's like in Mecca, in the Kaaba, They have a meteorite. Where did it come from? It came from Libya, from a Sabel culture in Libya. Well, there were Sabel cultures all throughout the Mediterranean. And so when you look behind, the fact is that the historians don't see what's behind, and they just make up stuff. They make up theories, and they're really silly. And we really can't perceive what those ancients perceived, but we can get a little closer than the historians do.
Yeah, just to give somebody a basis to be able to enter into the cosmology that associates with this, Rudolf Steiner says that when you look at the Greek pantheon, that you have Zeus represents on a certain level the astral realm, and that Poseidon represents the etheric, and the physical is Pluto or Hades. And so who is it that, that it's Pluto? He goes and rapes, right, Persephone, the daughter of Demeter. And Rudolf Steiner talks about how that the faculty of clairvoyance was universal for early mankind, and that it was ministered to him, and it wasn't something that we earned, and that these myths in ancient Greek give us an image of the metamorphosis of consciousness, and they give an artistic image rather than trying to analytically describe what process is involved. Even in the architecture, because you look at like the pyramids represent the coming to be an Osiris in the after death state. And then and then it moves into Greek culture, and those are places for the gods to dwell. And you don't even have to be there. It's for them, But then when you get to the cathedrals, Rudolf Steiner says a cathedral is not complete unless it has a congregation, so that it's this entry into, and it becomes this community impulse, which ultimately spurs on the development towards the individual human being. And so it's that ego impulse, the pure divine spiritual drop that is at the core of your being that makes you human, that is nobody has access to other than you. That's the important point to address. Now, if you choose to give it up and just become a soulless creature, well, that's your business, but I wouldn't go that way.
Yeah, that's not recommended. There's a warning on the tag with that one. So you mentioned the pyramid. That's the next place I went. So I'm on a tour boat. Okay, I'm doing my little 3 readings a day, hanging out with the captain, and people think I'm someone special, which was just wonderful. Eating like a king, and of course, I was a very picky eater. So we're headed to Egypt, and when we get there, first we stop in Alexandria, and I get off and do a tour, this long tour that goes into Cairo, goes down the Nile, goes to a few of the temples, this and that. And I just had amazing experiences when I was in Alexandria. I actually felt that I could almost, in the ethers, see the Library of Alexandria. And then I'm thinking, well, if this is true, my intuition tells me it just fell into the ocean there and it's still there. Ha! Like 20 years later, 30 years later, they find out exactly that. No one had taken the time to look right in the water, right below where they said it was. Bingo. They have full-size statues that are still perfectly preserved, everything. So I literally believe I saw in the imaginal world the burning of the Library of Alexandria and it toppling into Mediterranean Sea. But anyway, we get to kind of the end of the tour and it's time to see the Great Pyramid. So we go off and they say, okay, get on a camel and go over here to the Great Pyramid. I'm going, what do you think, I'm stupid? That's the Pyramid of the Moon. The Pyramid of the Sun's over here. That's the Mama Pyramid. That's the Daddy Pyramid. I'm going to the Daddy Pyramid. And they all of them tried to convince me I was wrong. I'm going, I know which one is the Great Pyramid. Okay, don't try to fool me. They got so mad. I finally had to say, just take some money out and say, will someone please rent me a horse so I can go to that pyramid? And some guy runs up out of the blue, some guy with 2 horses. I get on a horse. We head across the desert, get there. I go up to the entrance where there's a guard and he says, no, you can't get in here. Like, what? He just left me here. Wait, couldn't he have told me that before he took the horse? He says, no, you can't get in here. So I argue with the guy, right? And some people come out And I'm going, you said no one could go in here. So I'm really getting mad at this guard at the only entrance to the Great Pyramid, right? So he finally admits, yes, if you go over to that little teensy tiny hut over there and you pay this fortune, you can get a ticket. And I have to run across the desert, pay a whole lot of money, come back. He lets me in. And by then, there's no one in there. So I go through the whole thing. No one's there. And of course, like a good American, when I get to the king's chamber and I strike the sepulcher to see if it's true, and it rings a perfect A, like, oh, the perfect A. And I'm like, this is unbelievable. It's true. This was never a tomb. It was an initiation chamber. So there's a camera in the corner, and I go, look, I'm an American. We're like this. Excuse me, but I'm going to lie down in here, okay? Just for a minute. I'm not going to hurt anything. I don't know if anyone's watching. So I lie down, and it seems to me that I'm only there for seconds, and I hear an explosion. I mean, like I thought the pyramid was falling in on me. So I sit up. There's no noise. There's no people. There's nothing. I go, what is this? And I look back. There's my body laying there, but I'm sitting up. I popped out of my body, just like without even saying, hey, pop me out of my body, nothing. Boom. So then all of a sudden I say, that's it. I know the routine. I'm supposed to lay back down, 12 hierophants appear around me and lead me through the zodiac and blah, 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 blah. Well, all that happened, but it happened like lightning. And then it told me, oh, there's a secret chamber you should go to just for fun. So go out here. And as soon as you get out of the chamber, turn sharp to the left, and you won't even be able to see this little thing you have to go through. And then you climb up and you get into this chamber where you see these, the things that are above the king's chamber. You can actually see it, right? I'm thinking, oh man, if I could just spend the night here. But it was like the last day or something anyway. I had to get back to where I'd get on the bus to the boat, whatever. So I was only there for a while, but I'm telling you, it completely blew my mind. And seeing the Egyptian museums, because they let you touch anything. They don't have it all behind glass. So I'd touch all this stuff, and it was just utterly shocking to me. Sometimes it would just terrify me, absolutely terrify me, because it feels like I was being ripped through time. And if there were people around, any noise would like hurt. It was, so it was only good to do this when there weren't people around. So I went to Egypt. That was good. The next we went to Israel. Wow. That was strange because there was a bus tour that took us to all the holy sites, supposed holy sites. And basically, besides one, well, actually, I got in the Sea of Galilee, got in the River Jordan, got in the place. It was the cave that probably was St. John's cave, St. John the Baptist cave. And, all these different places, the Mount of Olives, the Tree of Skull, the Hill of Golgotha, the place of his tomb, the sepulcher, the Holy Sepulcher Church, all fake. I actually laid down in the slab that they said they prepared the body of Christ. I stuck my hand in the hole where the crucifix was supposedly. I went to inside of the grotto that is where he was supposedly born. I went to Bethlehem. All that's fake. All of that is fake. And when you're on the streets of Jerusalem, every once in a while, they'll show you an excavation dig down about, 12, 15, 18 feet. And those are the real streets back to the time of Christ. Wow, those are real. I couldn't touch them because they were too far away. But I did go to a place called the Cenacle, which was the place where there was the tomb, the original tomb of David, and the Essenes, who believed they were the only true priests left because all the Levites had been killed in the Assyrian captivity. They believed that was the place where they carried on their tradition. And near it was the first synagogue after the destruction of the Second Temple. So this is the Mount of Zion. That's very real, folks, but the structure's not real, but the land is real. So if you really want to touch the land, and everywhere that Christ had gone, that land was amazing. It was sacred. It was like something was raising you up. You were in a completely different place, but you were also seeing tanks, and everyone had a machine gun with the safety off and their finger on the trigger everywhere you went in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, though I didn't know it, the tour guide told me, she says, why is it that you cry every time we enter into the boundary of old Jerusalem? I go, oh, was I? I'd hear this sad, sad, sad song, saddest song I ever heard, a lament for Jerusalem, for being basically the seat of evil instead of the seat of Christ's redemption of the earth. Like the Dome of the Rock, that's fake. That's Mount Moriah. That's not Zion. When they tell you all these things are, that's all made up. That's what the Muslims told them. Remember, the Muslims knocked down the first Christian church, and that's what started more crusades. So the Muslims built it back. So what you're looking at is built by non-believers telling you that this is where all the events of Christ's life happen underneath one roof, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Complete nonsense. The church in Bethlehem, the Christian church in Bethlehem, they say this was the manger. Complete nonsense. But is it in the air? Oh, yes, it's in the air, and it's very real, and you can get healed if you just knew that. But the place that is the most profound that I experienced there was the cenacle. And I also realized that I wasn't incarnated at the time of Christ. Absolutely not. Somehow I was able to 100% become perfectly clear that I did not have an incarnation at that time or probably ever in Israel. And so then I thought, oh, this is amazing. Well, I got to keep searching. So I went on a lot of tours in the Mediterranean, and I went to so many places. It was ridiculous. But after that, we went to Ephesus. And there, though the temple had been knocked down, there were lots of remains, and there were caves of the people who believed in Cybele. And so the Cybele cult, the great mother cult, the triple goddess, was so alive there. It was utterly ridiculous. And so I thought, well, then when I get to the house of Mary, what's called the Dormition House of Mary, or where she went into her sleep, she died, went into a sleep supposedly for 3 days, and then she rose up into heaven, was assumed into heaven. So she never technically died. So I figured, oh, that's going to be fake. That's just a goddess thing that the Christians subsumed like they do with everything else. But I got there. No, it seemed to be 100% real. I laid on the spot that was the Dormition of Mary. And when I came to, because it kind of knocked me out, and again, I had to stay after the tour had gone, and I was going to spend the night in that place. But when I woke up on the bed of Dormition of Mary, I walked outside and I saw something that wasn't there. I saw these trees, these sacred trees, and I saw the Stations of the Cross. And I realized that in the house, Mary had the blood relics of Jesus, the spear, the veil of Veronica, the thorns, the nails, the spear of Longinus, the Grail per se, whatever they were using at that time, which I don't believe is still in existence. But all of those were in the house. And I never knew that. And I didn't know that that's exactly where Mary, because of some sacred trees that were sacred to Cybele and to Artemis, right outside, that the history, when I looked up the history of it, which wasn't even there was nothing there. That wasn't some place you could read about the history. I read that later. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, Mary, in my opinion, was assumed into heaven there. And she said, it says, the stories in front of the 72 disciples, including Longinus and Joseph of Arimathea. And then they left there with the three Marys and went to Marseille. Well, I believe that's probably true. And I believe the blood relics going to Marseille, going across France all the way to Spain and then to England, to Glastonbury, created the tradition that awoke the Maidens of the Well tradition and the tradition of worshiping female fairies all into one. And so it's just such a big mishmash. You can understand why there are so many versions, why some people are so confused, why there's so many claims, and so on and so forth. But I do believe, really, I was given a clear intuition, and it was one of the more profound things that ever has happened to me in my life, except the Damascus event, that Mary was real. She stayed in the cenacle for a while, because when I went to the land that the cenacle was on in Jerusalem, they said that's where the upper room was, that's where Last Supper was, that's where the Essenes, who believed they were the true priests, carried on their actions in Jerusalem next to the synagogue, almost as a opposition to them, as a stating that they're wrong and the Essenes are correct. Mary supposedly lived there and then moved with her disciples to Ephesus. I believe that, but I also believe she probably stopped in Antioch for a while first and then moved to Ephesus. and was protected there because of the whole goddess culture that was so utterly profound and still alive even to this very day there. So again, that would be one of the most profound things ever. Then I went to the island of Patmos and laid on the spot where John received the book of Apocalypse, the book of Revelations. And they said it's a stone bed inside a cave and there's a big crack right above it. Then they said that when the earthquake came, that crack was left there. Well, I laid on that and I had the absolute distinction feeling. That wasn't a direct intuition. I didn't see much. I just felt that it was absolutely true that John had been there on Patmos. That was the cave he was in. And that literally was the bed that he lay on. Again, it was a stone bed, ancient, just like the house of Dormition was one stone that had been carved into that uh, form of a house for Mary. So the tradition of the Grail now was becoming ever clearer to me that it was not Arthur. It was those were later versions of the fact that the blood relics, including the spear and the chalice, came from Jerusalem and the Cenacle to Antioch to Ephesus, and then from there, I don't know. But that was, part of the Mediterranean tour that started to truly open me up. And then my further research has led to the book called the Queens of the Grail, which has a lot of this in it. And now we can find certain historical justifications for some of these things.
Yes, I think it's important to stress the concept of the western end of Asia Minor, that was really an important place. I mean, you have the mysteries of Ephesus, you have the mysteries of Samothrace, and going on to all these various mystery centers, and tying into this culture of Dionysius. And Dionysius, or Dionysos, Rudolf Steiner, again, going back to the Wonders of the World lecture cycle, where he talks about the foundation of this cultural stream that was in preparation to receive the mystery of Christ later in evolution. And so that the role that was played by St. Paul in going and, his letters to the churches, in Asia Minor, for example, that there's a culture there that is prepared to understand the doctrine that he was going to give to them. And so you have the esoteric school of St. Paul, founded in Athens, with Dionysius the Areopagite as the leader. And he's like a judge, a high-ranking official of the Areopagus in Athens. And then Rudolf Steiner says that although people tend to refer to him as pseudo-Dionysius because it's obviously a 6th century manuscript, but he says, well, after him, all the heads of that mystery school took on the name of Dionysius. And so you have this seeding of culture that important aspects of are explained in Plato's Banquet, where the great woman who was a teacher of Socrates, Diotima, and the whole idea of Socrates with his daemon, that he was receiving his inspirations from the next world for his action to bring forth the being of conscience. And it's this idea of conscience that's the integration that is so critical for receiving the Christ mysteries through St. Paul. And so we've come to an interesting page in the historical meeting, because there's a separation between the exoteric and the esoteric streams of Christianity coming out of that western end of Asia Minor. And so it's quite fascinating, because you see that really it was Karl Koenig who said one should really look at St. Paul as a student of St. John the Divine. And that's an interesting and very subtle comment to make. But I want to thank you all This is so special for me and so heartwarming, given that he's my best friend and his dear wife, and they're just such a dynamic duo. And so we're going on this journey, and there's so many stories to tell that I'm afraid I can't give you any advance notice as to how many episodes there will be. But we're going to continue on in episode 13. In our next episode, which 13, that's the number of the Knights Templar, yes?
I'm going to talk about that next, going to Rhodes.
And Christ was, of course, was the 13th with the 12 disciples. And so there is a mystery number, and there's 12 edges on a cube. So we've completed the first cube of our journey. And I want to thank you all for being here.